And good evening, everyone, and welcome to the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. Tonight's session is titled Reckoning with the Role of Systemic Racism in Sparking the '92 LA Riots. And I'm joined by Jody David Armour, Professor of Law from the Gould School of Law at the University of Southern California. My name is Andy Mink. I'm the Vice President for Education Programs. On behalf of my team, Jira and Meredith and Mike, who's driving the back roads of North Carolina somewhere right now listening in, I do want to thank you for joining us. If I'm honest, it felt a little weird to not have an episode last week. Of course, the session that we had originally scheduled was rescheduled for November 30th. But I in some ways, not having a webinar reminded me of just how busy your schedules are, your days are. I suspect that this year is probably more disrupted and feels a little bit more unstable than even last year. And for all those reasons, we appreciate you being with us and spending time with us in this webinar series. In particular, I want to note that so many of you have registered in the comment box. You've shared where you were during May of 1992, whether that was in the classroom as a student or an educator, or perhaps as a young person. Some of you may not have been born yet, but I do appreciate you sharing all of your memories and your perspectives. And we are going to refer back to that and reflect on that a little bit in a moment. But I do want to thank Julia for joining us. Julia is here from Boone, North Carolina at Appalachian State. Christine, it's always great to see you. Old friend Christine from Charlottesville City Schools in Virginia. Linda's joining us from Western Piedmont Community College. Jasmine's here all the way from Alaska. Jasmine, thank you for suffering the time zone change and joining us. And of course, as always, we've got a large contingent of educators from Los Angeles Unified. We love having you in our sessions. And Lauren, Gary, Dexter, Delisa, thank you so much for joining. And I did notice, Marvin Garcia, that you both grew up, it sounds like, and now currently live about 5 miles from the intersection of Florence and Normandy. So I'm hopeful that tonight's session will have a lot of insights and things that bring clarity for you. The center, on the other hand, is located in Durham, North Carolina, seemingly a long way from South LA, but maybe not so much. Every year we have a fellowship class of university academics who are chosen to work on their projects here at the center. We get about 35 fellows a year from an application pool of about 700. So these are always interested and interesting people doing really great work in the humanities. And I can tell you, as I get to know the fellows, both past and current, that many of them, if not all of them, are consistently trying to understand how the humanities can help us understand the world we live in, how it can help us understand ourselves better, and by extension, how we interact with others in our community, and how we can be responsible and educated citizenry of this great country. So I'm very pleased that we're able to represent that level of scholarly insight. But the key to these webinars is that all of that scholarship and understanding, the wonderful insights that Professor Armour is going to share tonight, they only matter when you as educators can use them and apply them in your curriculum and in your conversation. It doesn't mean that you're going to be teaching everything that we talk about, but it does mean that the context and the sort of complexity of different events and trends and interactions, when apparent, can make you a much better prepared to discuss difficult topics like race and place and social justice in your classrooms, with your students, with your own kids perhaps. And I hope that you use our Humanities in Class digital library to continue to find resources that give you an opportunity to extend that conversation. Of course, many of you have joined the webinar series group in that same digital library, and that's where you'll find resources that were provided by Professor Armour in advance, resources that support the talk that we'll have tonight. It's also a place where other resources are curated and, if they're relevant, are put in that same place. I want to thank Brian Sheehy, who's with us tonight as our TA, for pulling together some instructional resources that help make that connection. I do encourage you to go to the digital library and continue to mine it, mostly because I can guarantee not only the high quality of the materials, but also that they're free and that they're openly licensed. And of course, for you as educators, that means you can use them without fear of any repercussion in your teaching, provide them to your students, and generally find ways to modify them for your own instruction. The National Humanities Center is really pleased to have all of our work represented, but really what multiplies it, what amplifies it, I think, is the inclusion of materials from over 95 other humanities-based organizations. These are organizations across disciplines, across fields, all of whom want to make some section of their materials, again, available in this OER platform. I'm really pleased tonight to be joined by Kate Mitchell, who is a 2021 Junior Fellow at Rutgers University in a Master's of Library Science degree. And she's here to share just a little bit about the work of the American Archive of Public Broadcasting and relevant materials that they have associated with tonight's topic. Kate, can you hear me? Hey, Kate. Don't forget to unmute yourself, Kate. Well, Kate, I'm very sorry that it seems like you've either lost connection or perhaps lost the audio. Jessica, I don't think that's on our end. I think it's probably on yours if you can easily restart your materials. But I will speak on behalf of Kate and mention that the American Archive of Public Broadcasting has wonderful exhibits of video and digital archives from a variety of time periods, and that does include the coverage of the LA riots. Please do go and take a look both at their site as well as ours, and you can use a keyword search and you can find all the wide variety of coverage. Is that you, Kate? Do I hear you?
Yes, it's me.
Oh, there you are. I'm sorry. Somehow I missed you. So, Kate, I queued it up for you, so now you can share a little bit more about your resources.
Okay, great. Hi, so my name is Kate Mitchell, and I'm a graduate student at Rutgers University, and I'm getting my master's degree in library and information science. And over the summer, I was a junior fellow at the Library of Congress, and as part of my project, I created an exhibition for the American Archive of Public Broadcasting to highlight the extensive collection of PBS NewsHour episodes. So in general, the AAPB's website is an excellent resource for anyone interested in public broadcasting. They have digitized and just made so much material available to the public online and have a number of exhibitions and special collections covering a wide range of topics. So my exhibition, which is not yet launched but is coming soon, hopefully, looks at how the PBS NewsHour covered major events of civil unrest in the U.S. from the early 1990s to 2021. So while some events were only covered briefly in passing during the news summaries, the coverage for other events continued for months and sometimes even for years afterwards. The 1992 LA riots, which is the main focus of my exhibition, repeatedly had segments dedicated to it for months well after the violence had ended. And even years later, the NewsHour continued to reflect on the circumstances of LA. This event functioned as a linchpin in the NewsHour to facilitate conversations about race, economics, and politics in America. And so today I just want to talk about one segment in particular that I do an in-depth analysis of in my exhibition essay, which is covering the coverage, which you can see on the slide, in which the NewsHour voices criticisms of television news media's portrayal of the LA riots, primarily discussing how other television news outlets used the word thug and hoodlum to describe the demonstrators and relied solely on helicopter footage, and had a lack of interviews and representations offered to members of the Black, Korean, and Latino communities. So in this segment, Jeffrey Kay, the LA correspondent, interviews Ruben Martinez and Brenda Pack-Thundo, who each discussed the lack of representation for LA's Latino and Korean populations during and after the riots. So Martinez stressed LA's ethnic and cultural diversity and took issue with television's oversimplification of the riots. He says South Angeles is 50% Latino, 50% African American, yet the TV coverage did not see the 50% that was Latino. And then Thundo, in criticizing the circulated images of the Korean merchants shooting guns, challenged the news media's portrayal of the Koreans during the riots, stating they were just firing back at people who were shooting at them. The reason the Koreans had to defend themselves is that, for 2 days there's just absolute lawlessness and their stores and lives were in jeopardy. So they had no choice but to defend themselves. But the image that was shown was very skewed just to show the shooting and not being shot at. So both journalists maintained that by excluding the experiences of the Latino and Korean communities, the television coverage of the riots did not communicate the full story of LA's unrest. So in general, the NewsHour's coverage of the LA riots strive to address these issues of representation and context. In another segment included in the exhibition, they cover the riots' impact on the LA community and discuss how many police officers arrested immigrants from Latino neighborhoods and turned them over to INS, which is now known as ICE. But there is no segment devoted to the impact of the riots on the Korean community. So just overall, the NewsHour extensively covered LA's unrest throughout the 1990s, thoroughly looking at the causes and effects of the unrest. And no other event of unrest was covered in the same intensive way by the NewsHour, which is fascinating. Anyway, that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much for sharing your work, and we're excited to see that when it's finally published. But I think what you're also revealing is the ways in which the resources available can allow educators and users of different backgrounds to stitch together and find these the evidence behind the conclusions like the ones that you've shared. Hey, Kate, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
I also want to encourage any of you who have interests in topics of race and social justice to scroll through the upcoming webinars. These are just a few that I selected as examples of other kinds of topics that you can join us for in conversation and learn more about not only the topic, but access the resources developed by our guest scholars. That does include Ayanna Thompson's rescheduled session for November 30th on decolonizing the Shakespeare curriculum. And then after the new year, we've got several that address this topic in various ways, including Phil Nell joining us to discuss Dr. Seuss, Jacoby Williams, former NCH Fellow 2016-17, his work on the global impact of Malcolm X, and then finally the historic roots of Black Panther with Thomas McDowell from Ohio State. If you haven't signed up, I hope to see all of you in any one or any of those sessions. And then finally, of course, each of you will be receiving a certificate upon the conclusion of tonight's session for 5 professional development credit hours. But it may be that you have a deeper interest in the topic, or you need to accrue some more professional development credits. If you do, I would encourage you to consider our winter session of online courses. That includes a course we developed with the Rock and Roll Forever Foundation on the ways that music can help you and your students explore issues of race, gender, and sexuality in late 20th century America. As always, I want to thank our Teacher Advisory Council for their continued work. I hope that some of you at least heard of our work through various TAC members. Again, all of us are crazy busy during this disrupted year, and for them to work in service during their tenure has been extremely beneficial and helpful. Finally, I want to remind you that your participation in tonight's session is critical. It's going to be a great talk. Professor Armour has got a lot of wonderful insights to share, but you can also share your thoughts, and that happens in the audience chat box in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. If you'd like to submit a more formal question, I, as the moderator, will be reviewing them as they queue up in the Ask Professor Armour tab, and then at different points I'll bring them to his attention and we can address them. If for any reason you lose power or sound, don't hesitate to refresh your screen or even log out and come back in. That won't disrupt your record of time that you've been with us. And it's a very easy way to kind of kickstart those, what sometimes are technical gremlins. Again, you've joined us tonight for the Humanities Class webinar titled Reckoning with the Role of Systemic Racism in Sparking the '92 LA Riots. I'm joined by Jody David Armour. And again, I'm very pleased that Brian Sheehy from Andover, Massachusetts has joined us as tonight's TA. Hey, Professor, can you hear me out in Los Angeles?
I can hear you fine, Andy.
And I can hear you as well. Professor, before we get started and before I turn the steering wheel of this PowerPoint over to you, I've got a question I'd like to ask you. I want to put you on the spot a little bit. You may have noticed that at the beginning of tonight's session, as I often do, I pulled together a playlist of songs that may have some relevance for the topic that we're discussing. Tonight's actually happened to be the top 5, Billboard Top 5 on May 1st, 1992. So these are songs, I'm sure a lot of the folks in our audience, whether they were adults or kids, or maybe even if they were born later on, recognize the songs. Music has a certain nostalgia. I can tell you that in response to my own question, my first year of teaching was 1992, and I distinctly remember standing in front of my first period class with this Time magazine cover. I think Time came out at the time on Tuesday, and probably by Wednesday or so I had this, and I was trying to figure out how to discuss it with my kids, my students in Central Virginia. Of course, it's really crazy and remarkable to think that, you know, there was no drip feed of real-time news back then. It was either, you know, weekly publications, or it was catching the newspaper in the morning in the driveway, or it was looking at the evening news, perhaps, to try to get some insights. But having said all that, I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about your perspective of talking about and discussing a topic of history that is also memory. That must be pretty tricky. How do you do that?
Yes, it's vivid memory at that, Andy, because you know how sometimes traumatic episodes really sear into your memory certain events. And I can remember the day, the time, and the weather when I first heard about the Rodney King beating and then saw it with my own eyes on television. You may remember, it was the first time when the footage was shown, it was the first time that we really got round-the-clock news coverage. Cable had just come in with this, 24-hour news coverage. That was around 91, 92. It was really quite new. And so you could sit there and turn on the TV. I was in Ohio and Pennsylvania at the time. I could turn on the TV at any time of the day or night and see this video of Rodney King being beaten by these LAPD officers, right? And that kind of constant drumbeat with our own eyes, seeing that go on and go down like that was new. It was novel. It was before, of course, way before Twitter. It was the first time we'd seen any videotaped evidence of police brutality quite like that. We take it for granted now because of the cell phones and the video capabilities of the technology we have now. But this really was the kind of first of its kind, right? And I also remember, Andy, that as the airwaves were being saturated by the visuals of Rodney King being beaten mercilessly by those police officers, at least that's how many of us viewed it. Obviously, the first Simi Valley jury didn't view it that way. But I remember in watching that and seeing that happen, no one took to the streets. There were no riots. There were no uprisings at that point. I know a lot of people have characterized the people who did take to the streets after the verdict was announced. They've characterized them as hooligans. But I remember thinking that if these were hooligans, just, thugs looking for any excuse to just go off, which is how they were characterized by the chief of police at the time, LAPD chief of police. If that's all they were, then they had ample provocation and excuse to just go out and go off when they turned on their TV and saw the airwaves saturated by this obscene abuse, but they didn't. Rather, they waited for justice. They waited for the criminal justice system to run its course and the promise of justice that system holds out to be made good on. And they only took to the streets when that promise of justice seemed so flagrantly flouted by that Simi Valley jury's verdict acquitting all the officers and telling Black people in the process that you can't trust or believe your own lying eyes. It was kind of like a mass gaslighting of Black America, because the officers are one thing. You can say, okay, they're bad officers, they're rogue officers, they're bad apples. You could kind of justify it or, rationalize it, excuse it that way. But, the jury is drawn from the community, it's supposed to represent the community's views and values. They're supposed to be expositors of community attitudes. And so for the jury to sit there and say, as a representative of the community, we don't see anything wrong here. We don't see anything that happened on this tape that went too far, right? That was an especially stinging kind of rebuke to get from the jury, and kind of gaslighting and deep insult, right? And so that is when the conflagration occurred, right? That's when all hell broke loose. And that's really the source of the riot. And I think that they are best understood in that way, Andy.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. By the way, Professor, I think I've got your phone now, so we might ask you to, there we go, much better, thank you. As a little bit of a follow-up, you've titled tonight's session the 92 LA Riots. Earlier in a chat box, one of our participants, I believe it was Julia, I could be wrong, referred this to the uprising. Talk to us a little bit about the vocabulary choices of referring to this as a riot versus an uprising.
Yeah, language is real important in all of this, isn't it? And it really drives home the importance of the humanities, because it's through the humanities that we really grapple with language, word work, its possibilities and limitations. And you really see that at play with things like riots versus uprisings versus revolts, right? Or versus some other kind of vocabulary that we could use. The idea of an uprising or revolt, clearly suggests that there is some kind of provocation or cause, whereas a riot sometimes can be something without any adequate provocation. People can start rioting sometimes because their team won or lost, right? I guess that's kind of a reason, but sometimes people start rioting for reasons that don't relate in any way to social justice. But the idea of an uprising and the idea of trying to slough off, some kind of oppression, that is what you capture with, something like uprising. But I'm okay with riots too, because like Martin Luther King said, riots are the language of the unheard, right? And sometimes we have to try to look at a riot and figure out what we aren't hearing, and try to decipher the meaning behind the riot, and not just deny that it is, and it's a cry without an alphabet. It is a riot is just an outpouring of frustration, can be of the kind we're talking about now, of frustration and rage and hurt and pain. And so I understand how it is important to pick our language, but I'm okay with riot myself. I understand though how others might prefer something else, that is more focuses on the fact that you're talking about social oppression and a response to it. But again, language. Think about how much, Andy, we're talking about language these days, from critical race theory to defund the police to Black Lives Matter to, we're constantly, debating the meaning of words and using that debate about the meaning of words to define ourselves, to, kind of define our social identity sometimes and vindicate our social interests. These meanings aren't just fixed and frozen. The meanings for words are kind of prizes and pitched conflicts between social groups trying to define themselves and vindicate their existence. So I'm glad that we're talking about language in this way. I think it's at the heart of the humanity.
Yeah, that's really great. And I want to note that Marvin noted, JD, I'm still getting that feedback. There you go. Thank you. I'm noting that Marvin in the audience chat box, in his opinion, riot is an academic vocabulary word. And it's interesting to think about the ways that we apply vocabulary to these events. Professor, I'm now going to turn the PowerPoint over to you and invite you to share with us your insights. And on occasion, I'm going to interject myself, bring you some clarifying questions, maybe some comments from the audience, and we'll go from there. Thank you again for joining us.
Thanks so much, Andy. And I am going to start with art and performing art. I spend a lot of my book in *GGA theory, race, language, unequal justice, and the law. I have the N word in the title of my book, right there. And it's there for a reason, to provoke critical reflection on these kinds of issues we're talking about, not only the nature of language itself and transgressive utterances and unsayable words, but also the very concept of a so-called N*GGA. Right? What exactly is that? Well, who do we refer to that way? who do we otherize with that word? And sometimes it's used to otherize, and sometimes it's used as a term of solidarity among Black folk, right? It's saying, this is my, or, I love my N-words, right? And so it not only provokes reflection on the nature of language, but also on who we otherize. We otherize especially Black folk, right? And Black males, and I have here, we're really choking jail cells and prison blocks with Black bodies. We saw that from 1980 to 2005. As Michelle Alexander points out, we went from 300,000 incarcerated people to 2.2 million, and grossly disproportionately, they were Black males. And part of what made it, I think, for us as a society able to tolerate that was we otherized these Black males. Even Blacks otherized young Blacks. One part of the title of my book comes from a routine by Chris Rock, Bring the Pain, 96, to launch his comedic career, in which he goes back and forth in front of a Black audience and says, there's like a civil war going on in Black America, and there's two sides. There's Black people and there's N-words, and N-words have got to go. I love Black people, but I hate N-words. Boy, I wish they let me go join the Ku Klux Klan. I do a drive-by from here to Brooklyn. He keeps on going like that, and his core definition of a so-called N-word is a Black person who's done crime, when you steal all his examples, right? And so by that definition, any Black person who's done a crime is an N-word, and the law abides. The rest of us Black people need to distinguish and distance ourselves from those bad Blacks in the name of politics of respectability. The problem with that kind of approach is when you do the math, you wind up with an obscene picture, right? Sadly, up to 90% of the young Black males in some of these inner city neighborhoods are going to wind up in jail, on probation, on parole at some point in their lives. I put this in an article recently, and we had to give it a pinpoint cite because the editor said it just sounds hyperbolic until you see the numbers, right? So by his definition, up to 90% of our own Black youth are N-words, and we are willing to accept that and laugh at it and give him amens and uh-huhs and preaches as he's saying it. Yes, that's what we were doing in the 90s. Black people were N-wordizing other Black people like that, as well as, so I wanted to really kind of think about what some of these people who we were demonizing, young Black males, what they were saying in their art about their own otherization. And NWA came right here out of LA area, right? Compton, you had Cube and Trey and Ren, a number of folks, part of the group. And what they were saying in one of the first songs I heard from them relates to the 92 riots. One of the songs that Ice Cube used to get arrested for if we went out and performed. The police would say, you go out on stage and utter those words, we're going to lock you up. And he'd go out and utter these words and they'd lock him up. He'd say, F the police coming straight from the underground. A young N-word got it bad because I'm brown and not the other colors, so police think they have the authority to kill a minority. Now, that's what he's saying. That's what they're saying in 1987, right? And they are expressing sentiments that 25 years later become the basis of the Black Lives Matter movement, right? Police brutality. He's saying this is going on, but we aren't hearing him a lot of times. A lot of us in the mainstream aren't hearing him because we're saying, oh, that's gangster rap. They're using profane language. But sometimes you can find the profound in the profane. And they were certainly prophesying what was going to happen by the time we get to 91, 92, that there was a fraught relationship between the Black community and the police. And there was a powder keg that was building and it was about to go off. If you listen to the music carefully, you heard that over and over. But we're too busy, censoring it and dismissing it and marginalizing that kind of music. So I wanted to say that did anticipate the 92 moment that we're talking about. And how do we find, going in here, how do we define systemic racism? Right, let's talk about that, because if this beating of Rodney King that we saw on video that then led to an initial acquittal, notwithstanding the video, what you might think was smoking gun videotaped evidence. It led to the acquittal. And then when the criminal justice system lost its credibility in the eyes of many Angelenos because of that acquittal, then the riots broke out, right? What is it that was behind that initial beating and that jury's acquittal that we find still, all these years later, we see eerie parallels with respect to George Floyd and a whole procession of hashtags that makes up the Black Lives Matter movement, going back to 2013, July 13th, when George Zimmerman was acquitted of shooting Trayvon Martin, going out to get some Arizona iced tea and Skittles, then Mike Brown a year later, and then the Black Lives Matter hashtag, right? Well, so why were we not able to make changes in 92 after that urban conflagration, one of the largest in American history up to that point, and certainly caused more property damage and lives and and a lot of misery? Why did we not learn lessons from that could have helped us avoid what we've been going through since the birth of the Black Lives Matter movement? What kind of systemic factors might be at play? And I want to talk about systemic racism, of course, but, what is systemic racism? A lot of times we throw words around: structural racism, systemic racism, without, kind of a clear sense of what their definition is. So as a lawyer, I'm wont to define terms, and I think it helps with precision if we do going in. A quick history, I think, of a controversial subject today will help me define systemic racism. I'm going to, in the process, define critical race theory because the two tend to run together. Not the caricature of critical race theory that you're hearing debated out here, in school boards, right? Of course, no one's talking about Derrida and floating signifiers and critical race theory to grade school, junior high students. And needless to say, even high school, the stuff I'm writing, college students tell me, this is some heavy lifting, Armor, so even college students, struggle with some of our dense prose when it comes to writing this stuff. But a quick history of critical race theory will shed light on what systemic racism is. You had the civil rights movement seemed to bring all of these great victories, right? In 1964, you had the Civil Rights Act of 64, which ended segregation in public places, banned employment discrimination. My very own house that I'm talking to you from had a covenant not to sell to blacks or Jews that folks entered into in 1956. Even though it wasn't enforceable, they were still putting it in the deed so that neighbors would feel a moral obligation to look out for one another by not selling to them blacks or Jews, right? So you had the Civil Rights Act of 1964 got rid of that. That was a crowning legislative achievement of the critical rights movement. The Voting Rights Act of 65, the Civil Rights Act of 1968, the Fair Housing Act prohibiting discrimination in selling and renting housing. Then you had Shelley Kramer, Brown v. Board of Education, Loving, Virginia. You had all these legal landmark cases and legislative landmarks. And Derek Bell looked around, and when I ran into him in the mid 80s, he was coming to my campus, the campus I was a student at speaking, and he was saying, we've had all these triumphs, but we are not saved. The gap between blacks and whites in wealth is growing. There's still great misery. Dark ghettos abound all over the nation. We haven't been delivered. And so people started saying, well, then there's only one of two explanations. If we got rid of formal discrimination, we got rid of anything that has to do with facial, kind of discrimination, then if racial inequality abides, if it continues and persists, then it must be either because, well, blacks are naturally inferior, right? And a lot of people jumped on that bandwagon. Charles Murray and Herrnstein and The Bell Curve was a best-selling book and still popular in a lot of places that says blacks are genetically inferior intellectually to non-blacks, right? You have Quillette, a popular online source. Last I looked, they had 5 or 6 brain measuring, skull measuring rather, skull measuring. I don't know. I'll use racist on their staff. Still talking about genetic differences between races. So you could explain the persistence of inequality that way, despite the achievements of the civil rights movement, or you could say what Derek Bell said and others, that there's systemic issues, there's systemic problems, that achieving colorblind formalism, that is making all laws racially neutral on their face, does not eliminate racial discrimination against blacks, right? That was the key argument. How does it persist? When they said basically in one or two ways, one, because of unconscious bias, this thing called, I did some early writing in this in the early 90s on the cognitive unconscious. Unconscious bias can cause people to take facially neutral rules and apply them in a discriminatory way, because unconsciously they treat people differently on the basis of their race when they're applying these neutral rules. Okay, that's one explanation, and a lot of critical race theory goes in that. That's a kind of systemic explanation that goes into the cognitive processes of the decision makers, whether they're jurors, whether they're judges, prosecutors, lawmakers. Unconscious bias can explain a lot of things in that way. That's one explanation. And another has to do with the continuing legacy of past discrimination in housing and in education and in employment. Right here in LA, if you walk down to a couple miles from where I'm living right here, I live in View Park, you go a couple miles from where I am, and you have the fiercest concentration of structural violence in America. We have the highest concentration, the largest and highest concentration of houseless folk in America, right down here in our Skid Row. And when you walk through there and you look to the left and right, you see that 75% of the faces you see are black. Not people of color faces, not, but black faces, right? Because those black faces are still at the bottom of the well. Just like Derek Bell was saying 20 years ago, and, the civil rights movement hasn't made a dent in that. And so to explain it, we have to start talking about things like systemic racism and structural racism. And I'll pause there for a moment, I think, Andy, just in case there are any questions before I go into exactly what, that kind of unconscious bias looks like and other matters.
Yeah, I appreciate you doing so, Professor. And again, I'm going to encourage the audience to, as they digest what you're sharing and how they feel about it and what they're anticipating next, to drop any formal questions in the Ask Professor Armour tab. But I would like you to, you brought this up, and I was sort of saving this for the end, and I'm glad you brought it up early. Of course, all of us know how weaponized the phrase critical race theory has become by media, by school board activists, etc. And you're right, there's not a single teacher at the K-12 level who is teaching critical race theory, even if they're teaching about race and social justice, etc. Give us just a short reaction or a short, informed, accurate explanation for all the teachers in the room right now who may or may not be accused or asked about critical race theory. Can you give us just a short kind of bullet point reaction to that notion of critical race theory and the fact that it's not the same as teaching about race and history?
Oh, yes. Rufo, one of the people who used this coinage of critical race theory, is a broad pejorative one for any mention of racial justice, inclusion, diversity, and equity. Let's put it this way, Andy. I don't know what you would want to call, let's say the right, for want of a better word, because I think that there are a lot of conservatives who don't necessarily agree with what's going on in some of these cases and believe in free speech very much, and I talk to them a lot. But there's a large segment of society that we're reading about and we're hearing about a lot that are saying that any mention of inclusion, diversity, and equity, a phrase that, let's say, 2-3 years ago, I can remember when we were using the phrase inclusion, diversity, and equity just routinely as a way of stating an aspiration, a goal. We're going to come together as a community around these values of inclusion and diversity and equity. Well, the right has been brilliant. I'm going to give them a lot of credit. They've been brilliant at convincing many people that any mention of inclusion, diversity, and equity is critical race theory. Any mention of historical racism is critical race theory. And any mention of any of those kinds of racial justice concerns is critical race theory, and that is a bad thing. Many times you ask either politicians or people what critical race theory means, and they'll give you a blank stare. And so this was to be expected, though, Andy. I think anyone who saw that generational upheaval in the streets of LA and around the nation and world, for that matter, 2 summers ago, when these streets were roiling with protesters here in LA for 6 weeks in a row, every day, without pause. And then that translated to huge victories at the ballot box with Measure J, 10% of the county budget going to, which is $1 billion a year, up to going to non-incarceration alternatives. They brought in George Gascon here in LA as a progressive prosecutor. And around the nation, you saw, something really going on that was remarkable, generational, jaw-dropping. Of course, there was going to be a backlash, right? This is to be expected. This is American history. Reconstruction after slavery, there was the first Reconstruction, which was, there were gains in racial equality, toward racial equality, and then there were major setbacks. And then we have the second Reconstruction with the Civil Rights Movement, right? And we've seen that hasn't necessarily yielded the kind of fruits we'd hope because of systemic racism, kind of things that Derek Bell was talking about. So now after what we saw on the streets, and all of the gains that we've seen around issues of inclusion, diversity, and equity, this kind of backlash is to be expected. And I think, the snappy response to people who, want to kind of label what anybody is doing critical race theory, if it has to do with trying to broaden our compassion for more people and make us a more inclusive world and society. I go back and forth on this, Andy. Sometimes I wonder, do you take the bait? Do you argue? I think you have to, because people have some misconceptions and concerns. I think you have to talk to people of good faith who just may have some misconceptions, and you can inform them about, what you're really doing, which is you're trying to prepare their child for the future. And the future is going to be multicultural. And so to be an effective manager at work, to be an effective lawyer in the courtroom, you have to understand all of these dynamics, right? I would not want you as my lawyer if you told me that you take the Trayvon Martin facts, George Zimmerman, Trayvon Martin, only you make Trayvon Martin a 17-year-old Brad Pitt, and you make George Zimmerman, say, a 35-year-old Wesley Snipes. If you tell me that a lawyer is going to say he or she expects the same outcome in that case as in the Trayvon Martin case, I'm going to wonder how effective you're going to be as a lawyer. You don't seem to understand some basic things about lawyering, right? And so just to prepare your child for this future, to really equip them, is to go through these discussions so that they don't, and we've seen in Fortune 500 companies how people have been dismissed because they just have 10 years and they said dumb stuff and stuck their foot in their mouth. To be a manager going forward in the future, to be a worker, to be a productive member of society, these are things you have to know.
Yeah, that's a really profound response, it seems to me, that we're preparing our students and our young people for their role as citizens in the future. And I've never quite heard it phrased that way, but that to me seems like it's a pretty elegant way of puncturing any sort of feedback. Professor, I've got one more question for you before we move on. This one comes from Rashid. Rashid is actually joining us from overseas. She's in Morocco. And Rashida is wondering if you can respond to this. Now, this has potential to be a long answer. And so I'm going to invite you, if you want, to wrap this into you moving forward if you feel like it might connect.
Cool.
Here it is. Rashida is wondering why, in your opinion, while significant institutional progress has been made, racism is still endemic. Do you agree with James Baldwin that, quote, you don't change attitude because you change the law?
Yeah, that is one of the core insights of the brand of racial justice scholarship that I've been doing, and many others have been doing, bringing home the kind of under the surface factors that make racial discrimination a persistent and nearly intractable feature of American social life, right? And that's, I know, depressing to hear when I say something like intractable. It sounds fatalistic, right? But when you think about what we're up against, sometimes that it can feel that way. So let's start with, you're right, Andy, I can segue right into an explanation of those underpinnings now. One of the things that I wrote about early on in my career as an academic was unconscious bias. At the time I was writing about it, this is like 90, 91, in the legal literature, the model of unconscious bias, or the unconscious, was a Freudian one. Charles Lawrence had a famous article, The Id, the Ego, and Equal Protection, Reckoning with Unconscious Racism, right? And so I said, I like the idea of, you pointing out unconscious influences on decision makers, whether they're judges, jurors, lawmakers, whoever, but I don't like the Freudian part, I'm afraid, because if you don't buy the Freudian paradigm model, right, if you aren't already, somebody who buys that approach, you're not going to be convinced by it. So I wanted something that's more empirically demonstrable and replicable and that could convince people. So I looked at social cognition and other areas of cognitive psychology that take an information processing approach to human cognition, right? And so you can go in the lab and you can use your stopwatch and you can actually see unconscious discrimination going on, in the reaction time. Later, this came to be known as implicit bias, but, and people started calling it that. But back then, we were just talking about bias rooted in the cognitive unconscious. And that can still sound strange. People can say, well, how can unconscious really drive people's behavior? Well, the way I've explained it to students from a cognitive standpoint is this. You have, and it's important to distinguish between prejudice and stereotypes on the basis of this distinction. You have some of our mental processes, William James pointed this out way back in the day, that some of our mental processes, when we repeat them often enough, they become habitual. They become well-learned sets of associations that can run automatically without our conscious awareness, right? That is, so for example, when I teach my sons to drive, as I taught all three of my sons to drive, so I can remember vividly now, and you can remember when you were learning to drive yourself, when you first get behind the wheel, every maneuver that you make requires intention, attention, and effort. It requires your controlled processes, right? Turning the wheel, hitting the brake, hitting the gas, and if you're driving a stick, learning to drive a stick, I'll be honest, I hate to admit this, but when I taught my three sons how to drive a stick shift, I rented one from Enterprise because I knew there was going to be a learning curve, right? Because now you have the turn, now you got one foot on the clutch, now you got one on the stick and the brake and the gas. And initially, it's a slow and ponderous process, right? But with enough repetition, when it's done often enough, when it becomes a well-learned set of associations, you can drive down the street. After a couple months, I was driving down the street with my son, and we were arguing healthcare reform while they were driving because a lot of those maneuvers were no longer did they have to those maneuvers weren't part of their conscious mental processes anymore. They could run automatically without their conscious awareness. I've driven out of my garage and wound up at school, which is about 2 miles from here, wound up at USC, and I couldn't even tell you how I got there. I remember leaving my garage, and I remember pulling into the parking lot, but in between, I was kind of on automatic pilot. I think a lot of us have had that experience. That's the cognitive unconscious. That's how a well-learned set of association can work. They run automatically without your conscious awareness. And once you realize that stereotypes are that's what a stereotype is, a well-learned set of associations that can run automatically without our conscious awareness, then you realize the power of the cognitive unconscious. I think about, Andy, the story by Phyllis Katz in the New York Times some years ago about a 3-year-old in New York, about a 3-year-old white girl who, upon seeing a black infant, said to her mother, "Look, Mom, a baby made." Right? Now, that 3-year-old little girl was not a racist or bigot. She was simply reporting an association that had been forged in her memory between women from a certain social group and an occupation she in her social life that she always saw them in. Right? She may reach the age of judgment, 18, say, and come to renounce that as an appropriate way to think about black women at all. Right? She may have egalitarian personal standards for how she should respond to the world. But that doesn't mean that well-learned set of associations just disappeared, right? It's still there, and it can still run automatically without our conscious awareness and drive our judgments and decision-making. And that's how the cognitive unconscious works. So once you recognize that what we're talking about with stereotypes are really mental habits, because what is a habit but a well-learned set of associations that can run automatically without our conscious awareness? That's a habit. Once you realize that stereotypes are like mental habits, then you also recognize that you can't really combat a mental habit by ignoring it. If you're trying to break a bad habit, whenever you're in the presence of cues that trigger the habit, what you have to do is call to mind your conscious conviction for how you're going to, respond. You're not going to fall into the habit, right? It takes intention, attention, and effort to resist or combat a habit. In other words, not color blindness, but color consciousness, right? You have to be aware of the fact that you're talking to a member of a stereotype group and you are prone to falling into stereotypical responses unconsciously, and you have to resist that. And in my books, I go into some detail about data that supports that and different ways that might work. But I have to say this, Andy, finally, with regard to all of this, I was super optimistic back in the 90s when I was first writing about unconscious bias. I was going around to corrections officers, police departments, judges, chambers, everywhere. I was, preaching the gospel. Hey, we have these unconscious mental reflexes, and all we have to do is control them, and we can become more just and fair. I've seen the data over the last 7-8 years especially, and it's been very depressing, and it all points in the same direction, and that is, yes, we have these unconscious mental reflexes, this unconscious bias, but there's very little we can do about them. We can think that we're doing something about them when we get implicit bias training and all that, but the data is not coming back supporting the efficacy of those kinds of implicit bias trainings and really de-biasing decision makers. And so, in a way, that's the fatalistic part of this. There's not a lot we can do with these unconscious biases that we have, right? Maybe about all we can do once we recognize that there's not much we can do about them is if you know that there's a good chance that you're going to fall into the stereotype habit with respect to members of stereotype groups and treat them negatively. If you know that that's human nature, it doesn't mean you're culpable, it just means you're human. But it's human frailty that hurts minorities and people from marginalized communities. So if you want to minimize the harm that those stereotypes can cause members of those stereotype groups, then you're going to have to minimize the contacts between the members of those stereotype groups and people like police, for example, right? If you conclude that, okay, we cannot give officers implicit bias training and de-bias them, that just doesn't happen. Officers are people too. They're human. They share all our human frailties and biases, including all these stereotypes that can hurt these members of stereotype groups. If we can't de-bias officers, then what we need to do if we want to minimize the harm that they can cause to these stereotype communities is minimize the contact between them and those communities. In other words, why do we have them enforcing jaywalking laws or a lot of the traffic stuff. Think about how many of these encounters involve traffic stops gone awry. There are lots of ways having officers respond to houseless people down here in Skid Row. We can have other people doing that. There are other mechanisms to do that would reduce the contact between police officers and the communities that they cannot help but discriminate against. It's not their fault. They're just human. They have these unconscious biases, but these unconscious biases result in real harm to these communities. So I'll kind of pause there too before going on to the final part, I think, of what I have to say, Andy, which is, an intervention that we can make is a humanities intervention to help with this. That is an art and justice intervention. But I'll pause here for now.
Yeah, and I don't use this term flippantly, but as a punchline, that's exactly what we're looking forward to hearing. And I think what the humanities ultimately offer are those kinds of solutions for the world we live in and the people we've become. We've got a couple of questions that are popping up. One of them comes from Jake. Jake is joining us from Santa Cruz, California, so just up the coast, up the one. He's wondering if you can speak. This is going to go a little bit off center, I think, from what you've discussed so far, but can you discuss at all the scars on the landscape? We've talked about the people. We've talked about individuals, sort of in the ways that these have transformed Southern California and Los Angeles specifically. But what kinds of impact do the things you're sharing have on landscapes like Los Angeles itself, cityscapes, economic interaction between the consumer, the buyer, and the producer, the store? So what's it done to Los Angeles as a place?
Yeah, spaces and flows. Understanding a city and discrimination in a city is really about understanding places and spaces and how social forces flow through those different places and spaces, right? The safest places and spaces are not the ones with the most police in them, right? They're the ones with the most resources in them. There aren't a lot of police. You go to Pacific Palisades around here, Brentwood, Bel Air, you don't see, your friendly community policing police knocking on everyone's door. Yeah, hi, how are you? I'm just a friendly, community police. Is just anything I can help you with? No. What you see is people who value their privacy, and they don't need or want any of those kinds of interventions. And they don't need them because they're not high crime areas. They have resources, right? And so it is resources that make you safe, not the presence or absence of police. And so, yes, we still have a lot of spaces in LA now that are much more heavily policed than other spaces. And they are justifying that higher concentration of police presence with things like predictive policing now. They have algorithms that they're using, and they're coming up with rational justifications for putting a lot of police in certain communities, and then having those police in those communities, those spaces, and those places really, and do things like enforcing jaywalking laws in Beverly Hills. This isn't one of the communities I'm talking about, but Beverly Hills, there's a recent LA Times piece that it was 90 or 92% of the people they stopped for jaywalking were black. Only 2% of Beverly Hills is black, right? So we put police in spaces, and then we give them a lot of this discretion, to crack down on quality of life offenses, et cetera. And that makes those spaces a lot less comfortable to live in. I live in a space now called View Park, for example. View Park, Baldwin Hills, Windsor Hills, you put them together, you probably have the highest concentration of upper middle class and upper class blacks in the nation. Well, one of the highest for sure. But right, 150, 200 yards down the hill from me is the jungle, which was notorious for a long time for its high crime rate, et cetera. So you have in these spaces a lot of issues that I wouldn't have if I lived in, for example, Palisades. So when I go out the house, I do have to worry about sheriffs and LAPD, and I've had multiple encounters with sheriffs and LAPD just because I have an afro and I'm driving around in a car that doesn't look like it should be, a black person in South Central should be driving in a car like this unless he's probably lifted it. So just to get to school from my neighborhood to USC, I've had police pull me over and bring in helicopters because they've assumed I was a flight risk. I've had sheriffs pull guns on me in my own house because one of the shot spotters went off and they misidentified where it came from. I don't think that my Beverly Hills or Brentwood neighbors are having shot spotters going off and sheriffs pulling guns on them as they walk out their front door. So yeah, the spaces and places that we concentrate law enforcement still define the character of LA in a lot of ways.
Thank you. My job as the moderator is also timekeeper, and I'm reluctant to say we have about 25 minutes left. I'm going to give you one more question before we go to the conclusion of your presentation tonight. Talk a little bit about the role of and the ways we should think about other minorities in America, using Los Angeles perhaps as a case study. And I mean by that, I mean BIPOC, Asian American, Latinx. How do all these groups fit into what you're sharing?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one of the things that you noticed, I think, powerfully 2 summers ago, as the streets again were roiling with hundreds of thousands, millions of people all over the nation, when you looked at those crowds, how diverse they were, right? They tended on the young side, they were younger, teens, 20s, 30s, certainly, some 40s, 50s, some of my cohorts were in there too, but, a lot of youthful, not just enthusiasm, because that's patronizing, but optimism, and hope, and it was so multicultural, and they were all coming together though around a clear theme and message, and that is Black Lives Matter. They were coming together as allies, right? And as if you will, accomplices, some would even call themselves, right? But certainly as allies of the struggle that Black lives were going through, because they recognized, I think, this has been what's powerful about the Black Lives Matter movement from its inception. It's never been exclusive of other groups. It's always been Black Lives Matter, comma, TOO, or two, right? Or Black Lives Matter, comma, also. There's been an ellipsis, an implied ellipsis, and people only pretended that they didn't understand that initially when they say, oh, why do you say Black Lives Matter, all lives matter? And then you saw that they really knew what it meant all along, because a couple of years later they started saying Blue Lives Matter, and you say, oh, you got it all along, but now you just, what has been going on from the beginning is a recognition that the faces at the bottom of the well, as Derek Bell would put it, the black, like I said, you walk through Skid Row here in LA, the absolute, bowels of this society, economically, socioeconomically, and it is 75% Black. Forrest Stewart points this out in his book, Down, Out, and Under Arrest. And so recognizing that if we can, this one of them, the nation's original sins, one of them, the extermination of the indigenous population being one huge one, and then the enslavement of millions of human beings, another, reckoning with that, coming together around that and saying if we can get at the bottom of that, it's going to lift. It's going to be a rising tide that lifts all boats. When Black lives start to matter, once Black lives start to matter, trust me, that there's going to be by almost dint of the fact that they're at the bottom of the well, there's going to have to be greater sympathy and empathy for other lives. And you've seen that with Black struggle generally, right? The civil rights movement, not only did you hear Black power, then you started hearing gray power when the, AARP, senior citizens started saying, other groups started, partaking of that energy of the Black struggle. So I think that there's a lot of, what I saw in the streets gave me a lot of heart about our ability to bring everybody together around a social justice vision.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, Professor, why don't we move forward with the remaining slides and your thoughts? And again, I'll have a few questions at the end.
Great, yes. And I will, I just had to throw Breonna Taylor in here because one of the systemic things that we're going to have to address before I get to what I'm going to focus on is, laws like the war on drugs. Breonna Taylor is not only no longer with us because of a no-knock policy, no-knock warrant, but because of the war on drugs that no-knock warrant was used to facilitate. So the failed war on drugs, she was killed as much by the failed war on drugs as the no-knock warrant. And so, when we're talking about systemic fixes for some of these problems at the legal level, that's certainly what I think we have to keep our eyes on. Now, the fixes, Andy, the fixes are, have to take many forms. The one I've been focusing on that's been humanity-centered is the effort to use the humanities to reach audiences and groups with messages that they would not hear as clearly or be moved by nearly as much if they came in some other way, in some other medium. Let me give you an example of what I mean. I've been arguing, I argue in my book, my latest book, In Astor's TGA Theory, that we need to radically overhaul our moral framework if we're going to make deep cuts in racialized mass incarceration by abandoning, repudiating the moral framework we've been using for the last 40 years, namely retribution, retaliation, and revenge, and replacing it with a moral compass, a moral framework rooted in restoration, rehabilitation, and redemption, right? And the new kind of progressive prosecutors from Chesa Boudin to George Gascon to Larry Krasner out in Philadelphia. How can I forget Larry Krasner? He's been holding it down out in Philadelphia. They've really been able to adopt an entirely new moral framework, right? That's been jaw-dropping. You couldn't have imagined the concept of a progressive prosecutor even 7-8 years ago. I would have bet my house on the proposition that that someone like Larry Krasner wouldn't have been elected to the head DA of Philadelphia with only never having prosecuted a case in his life, been only a public defender and defense attorney his whole life, and running on a platform of end cash bail, address police misconduct, and in racialized mass incarceration. He got 75% of the voters of Philadelphia to vote for him on that platform. That was unthinkable to me 7-8 years ago. And so there's been this radical shift in moral frameworks, this shift in the Overton window when it comes to these moral framework matters. And how do you get people to make a move like that? I was confronted with that problem 10 years ago when I had to put on a did put on a play in Bovard Auditorium at USC as part of our Visions and Voices program series, rather. And the call of the question for the evening was, should we pour liquor for Tukey? Stanley Tukey Williams had just been put to death when Arnold Schwarzenegger denied his stay request, execution stay request. And he was co-founder of the Crips. and had, without doubt, had killed people with his own hands. And the call of the question for the evening. So I'm not talking about low-level nonviolent drug offenders, because that's not mostly what's in prison, contrary to what Michelle Alexander says in the new Jim Crow. That's simply not the case when it comes to state prisons. 87% of the people in prisons are in state prisons, and most of them are not there for low-level nonviolent drug offenders. A lot of them are there for violent offenses. So you're going to make deep cuts in racialized mass incarceration. You're going to have to think morally about violent offenders very differently. So I had, should we pour liquor for Tukey, was the call of the question for the evening. And I knew I wasn't going to get a lot of sympathetic identification with Stanley Tukey Williams, 1,100 students, faculty, and staff, just with a lot of lawyerly arguments, just with a lot of, propositional content. I knew, that art is what changes hearts and minds, is what moves people. Art invites you into a different narrative perspective. And from that different narrative perspective, you can develop sympathies and empathies that you might not otherwise have considered even. And so I drew on the power of art over the course of the evening to make the case for Stanley Tukey Williams. I was carrying a brief for the damned, a closing argument for the damned. And so I had Macy Gray's youth orchestra, 12 to 18-year-old, do a straight ahead and then a hip hop version of Lift Every Voice and Sing as a example of a national anthem, songs and art that bond people, that bring people together. I had a Lula Washington Dance Company do a modern dance to Tupac Shakur's Brenda's Got a Baby. Tupac and Brenda's Got a Baby writes about a 12-year-old black girl who's raped, has a baby. People turn their back on her. And the ending couplet is prostitute found slain, Brenda's her name. She had a baby. And we asked then, what if the baby Brenda had was Stanley Tukey Williams? He comes out and goes into the foster system, is abused there, and now we have to sit in judgment on him. And then I had other, performances. Saul Williams, Maida DeBallier, IQ performed live. Everyone was performing live, of course. And at the end of that evening, and you can see this on the video, you had almost all, just 900,000 people standing up, with most with lighters in the air for Stanley Tukey Williams, because that's the power of art. That, as lawyers, what we are professional persuaders. As a lawyer, you don't hardly open your mouth or write anything unless you're trying to persuade somebody of something, right? And so we study rhetoric. We think a lot about rhetoric. And because that's persuasive, communication, right? And I know as a lawyer that the most powerful rhetoric a lot of times isn't going to be legal arguments. It's going to be art. It's going to be dance. Of all the performances that night, that dance performance really moved the audience. Seeing what happened to Brenda and the abuse that she went through and all the rest, it was very moving. And at the end of the night, and at the end of the day, I recognize that, the systemic factor that most concerns me, this unconscious bias, this unconscious indifference we have to these black folks that we otherize so often, that one way to cut through that is through art. And that's what rappers, I'll end with this. That's why I started this out with the rappers in WA, right? Because they were saying, we're the ones you call the N-word. We are black, many of us are engaged in lives of crime. We're young people engaged in lives of crime, so you would call us the N-word. Well, let us give you the world from our perspective. Let us penetrate pop culture with our own narrative, invite you to look at the world through our lenses, and then judge us, right? And that is the power of art that I was trying to draw on then, and I think where we got to go going forward if we're going to unify and rally together.
That's fantastic, Professor. You've got a handful of more slides. Would you like to narrate those for us, and then we'll have some concluding questions?
Okay. Yeah, I'll be very brief with this. This is a lot of this. I went to. This is we will go from Rodney King to today, pretty much, and this is when you start. When you get to today. And you see that the issues underlying Rodney King are still here today. then why aren't we looking for systemic issues? So that's why those slides were there. I wanted to bring home that, in a way, depressingly, I wrote my first book in 1987, and I've heard people say it's like I could have written the book yesterday. Ain't nothing changed but what year it is, in so many ways with respect to so many of these issues. Hurricane Katrina, I didn't get to get into this today, but when we were talking about unconscious bias, one of the things I was going to talk about was our unconscious empathy bias. There are a number of studies now, because when I first started doing this, they didn't have brain imaging studies. Now they do. So now we can say, here's your brain on race. And we see that at the level of mere neurons, that out-group members of in-group members don't have empathy for out-group members, and it's unconscious again. You just don't feel the pain. And so here in Hurricane Katrina, you had Black folks standing on rooftops with water up to their necks, literally, and 1 day goes by, 2 days go by, 3 days go by, 4 days. 4 days go by. I remember Sean Penn rowing up there handing out fresh water because FEMA still hadn't gotten its act together 4 days in. That's an empathy deficit. That's severe. And you didn't see that kind of reaction, though, to the victims in 9/11. When those planes ran into those buildings, there was a panic of empathy for those victims, and we just got it done. And I go into a lot of research about why that is happening at the unconscious level. This is the power of the connection between law enforcement and a certain perspective on the world. And you remember he was saying at one of these that you don't have to worry about being too careful with suspects when you're putting them in the back of cars, and things like that. And finally, this is the other bad word that you can utter in polite company, and that you're not supposed to utter along with critical race theory is defund the police, right? But all this is saying is I belong to a group called Law Enforcement Action Partnership, which are current and former police chiefs, captains, lieutenants, all the way down to rank and file. And they'll tell you that they've been burdened with too many tasks. Often they've been turned into street level social workers that, maybe we do need to unbundle the police. And some of the studies I was talking about earlier say if we want to minimize the contact between police and the community members, we may have to start to invest in other kinds of things than the police, which has been our reflex.
Fantastic, thank you. Professor, I've got a couple of questions I'd like to bring to you to conclude. And the first question is a little bit of a thought experiment. JD, I'm going to ask you to turn your volume down. That way I won't get that echo. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to turn it down, yes.
Yeah, thanks, we're good. A little bit of a thought experiment. Sometimes we live in such a polarized world, and we've done a lot of webinar episodes with various scholars who discuss polarization in our current culture, polarization historically. We've looked at it through a variety of lenses. I should also mention, and I've dropped this in the chat box, that we've had previous sessions on the language of protest around defund the police. We were joined by Austin McCoy at Auburn, as well as mass incarceration with Heather Thompson up at University of Michigan. But my question for you is this. As a thought experiment, can you imagine the other side of this coin, the critic who hears tonight's session or hears you speak or read your book? What do you think is the best counter argument to what you're sharing, or how would you describe that counter argument, and then how would you puncture it?
Excellent, Andy. I love that question because that's what I stress with my students. I tell my law students, they'll tell you, I probably say it too much, but I say over and over, you should be able to write a brief for the other side of the argument, the other side of the case. You should be able to write a brief for the other side that's more eloquent than they can write. And then you got to take on that brief, right? You should really be able to imagine, get in the skin of the other side from whatever position you're taking. And that is the only real way to be effective as a communicator. You have to understand what it is that's moving people on the other side. And so I would start with I would go right to murder victims, and I would go to a lot of times when we're talking about people who suffered fatalities in their family, had people killed by violent wrongdoers, they really seek retribution. They want retribution, retaliation, if you want to call it that, revenge, even if you want to call it even that, because that, why that may be making, they would say, something negative that isn't necessarily negative. It's an appetite or an urge, a retributive urge that should be satisfied and can feel satisfying, for some. So I understand that the pull of that, and I saw that happen, for example, with George Floyd. People wanted Derek Chauvin. 25 years wasn't enough, 40 years, 50 years, and yes, he's going to be in solitary all that time, which has been called torture by international tribunals and authorities. But that's, we don't care, because we really, a lot of people would say we really, he's a killer. Don't have any sympathy for a killer. He's just a monster. Just a monster. And that's what I'm trying to work against, this monsterization, even of violent criminals. So I'm going to start with that then, Andy. I take my students up to, I'm going to go with the mother of murder victims. And I take my students up to San Quentin, and we have sat down as part of a program called No More Tears with mothers of murder victims and lifers, that is, men doing life without parole. And then here I am with my seminar. And here's how a typical session would go, Andy. A mother of a murder victim would stand up and say, "This is my daughter, son, this is my loved one, my dear heart. And this person was ripped from our family. And it tore up our family. It devastated our family to lose this person. And here they have pictures of them as kids when they're doing things as young folks, and they'll pass it around, and we'll sit there with that." Right, Andy? And then one of the lifers will stand up, and let's say he has 10 minutes. He'll spend the first 5 minutes talking about who his victim was. And if he has any literature about the victim, he'll send that around, any accounts of what the victim happened to the victim's family. And he'll say, "I tore apart this family and I destroyed this victim's life." And only often they'll say something like, "And it would take a depraved person to do that." And then he'll say, with the last 5 minutes, "Let me tell you how I became that depraved person." And a shocking number of them are from foster care, et cetera. And you'll find that, they'll talk about being thrown in car trunks and having them slammed on them as a 3-year-old as discipline for 3 and 4 hours at a time, cigarette burns, molestation. And we sit with that. And one of the things that hits you, Andy, is, number one, it's harder to see that think about the same hard distinction between victims and victimizers. You see that victimizers are often victims too. It's not a simple binary, and you start to really appreciate that hurt people hurt people. And so, that's as far as I can get. I've been able to get with my students and with others who've gone through this experience that, just sitting there with both and trying to really feel both it calls for a lot from us. It's very challenging, but I think it's what we need to aspire to if we're ever going to do anything about mass incarceration.
So what you're describing, it sounds like, is that empathy piece that the humanities really are designed to give people practice in. The humanities are almost like training wheels whereby you can read about or hear about or study about others and their experience to try to put yourself in that position. And if you can gain a whole lot more understanding.
That's absolutely it, Andy. And here's one of the ways, I'll just keep this real short, that you've seen the humanities, in a sense, play out in the form of drama. I'm I'm thinking television because of COVID. I've been watching a lot of it, watching a lot of binge watching a lot of TV. And one of the things you see in about, I'd say, man, 80% of the narratives are about retribution, retaliation, revenge. Somebody getting their comeuppance, somebody getting some payback, And so when you think about things like we need to move away from that moral framework to one rooted in restoration, redemption, and rehabilitation, you realize that the humanities, the stories we tell, the narratives we can give one another, they really drive a lot of these retributive urges or other kinds of responses that we can have. And so far, we aren't seeing the kind of stories we need that will help us midwife this new kind of moral compass and moral framework that we need to address racialized mass incarceration.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Last question for you tonight, Professor. It's going to be a personal one. I hope you don't mind. Here's my question. Are you optimistic?
Here, I'll just say this real quick. Derek Bell, when I used to talk to him, he had a permanence of racism thesis, and he kind of he said his permanence never going anywhere. And I used to think, oh man, that's just way too fatalistic, Professor Bell. Back then, I was a student. Professor Bell, that's just way too fatalistic. The older I get, Andy, sadly, the wiser he gets. I start to recognize that the needle hasn't moved as much as I would have hoped. And, but I don't give up. That doesn't make me want to fight any less. Derek Bell's kind of response to this, and I got this from watching a movie called The Rape of Reese Taylor, which was about a black woman in 46 or so. Rosa Parks helped her, tried to help her get justice. She was a 17-year-old coming from a church service, and she was raped by 6 white boys, 12 to 18. And in the course of the movie, you're hoping there's going to be some kind of justice. And at the end, none of her assailants suffer any consequences. In fact, most of them go on to prosper and do very well. And so it's not like there's such a thing as karmic justice. And so you're just kind of left there like, well, what do I get out of this? Well, what I got from her and watching this film was, even in the face of what looked like futility, she had defiant resistance. They could not take her defiance away from her. They could not take her defiant resistance away from her. And that is sometimes, I think, all we can have. It's all I can kind of depend on, that myth of Sisyphus pushing the boulder up the hill and it keeps rolling back down. He may be confronted with futility, but he may still have a defiant resistance. He can still be defiant in the face of it, and that is there's something really ennobling about that at the end of the day. That's what gets me through the day anyway, Andy.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right, and it is a sort of a personal reflection on that. And I do feel like all of the educators that are with us tonight are working with young people. My own kids are college age, and the level of investment and interest in the outcome of the world they live in to me is just an amazing and sometimes jarring thing. I asked the same question, by the way, to Eddie Glaude Jr. about a month and a half ago at the conclusion of his webinar episode on James Baldwin, and he reminded us that in 1835 there was absolutely no evidence whatsoever that anyone who was enslaved would ever be free in their entire lifetime. Yet it happened. So
here.
Optimism is a currency that sometimes is pretty scarce, but I think it's conversations like the one you've led tonight that will get us just a little bit closer. Professor,
and I'm going to throw this in for 10 seconds. My own dad was sentenced to 22 to 55 years for possession and sale of marijuana, and was able to appeal his way successfully out of jail by teaching himself the law and becoming a jailhouse lawyer. So anything is possible. I hear you there, Andy.
Yes. Professor Armour, thank you so much for joining us tonight and for sharing your insights. I hope that we can keep in touch and that you'll high five many of our participants who live in LA. Brennan lives in View, in the View area that you do, I believe. So you guys can hang out on the next time you're walking down the area. Hey, thanks so much for joining us, Professor.
Thank you so much. This has been a blessing. Thanks.
And I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight for tonight's episode. Please do follow the National Humanities Center on our Twitter feed and on our website to see upcoming activities. We're adding new opportunities all the time. And while we try to actively and aggressively push that out to you, I if you can pay attention to those social media feeds, you'll be up to date. And I do hope to see you at our next webinar scheduled for November 16th. I'll be joined by Peniel Joseph from the University of Texas at Austin. Dr. Joseph is going to work with us on the other activism of Dr. Martin Luther King. We know him, of course, for his iconic work in the civil rights movement, but he did a whole lot of other things in particularly the mid to late 1960s, and Professor Joseph will be sharing that with us. Thank you again for joining us. Have a great and safe day at school tomorrow, and we'll see you next time on the Humanities in Class webinar series. Good night, everyone.